Greetings, adventurer, and welcome to the Elder Scrolls Library. My name is Aurelius, your lore master, and today we are reading and discussing Shezarr and the Divines. The book Shezarr and the Divines appears in 3 of the Elder Scrolls games: Oblivion, Skyrim, and Elder Scrolls Online. The book discusses the god Shezarr and the history that he has with the pantheon of the 8 divines. Let's get into Shezarr and the Divines. Shezarr and the Divines by Faustulus Junius, Sub-Curator of Ancient Theology and Paleonumerology, Imperial Library. The position Shezarr enjoys in Cyrodiilic worship is often misconstrued. He and 1,000 other deities have sizable cults in the Imperial City. Shezarr is especially venerated in the Colovian West, though he is called Shor there, as the West Kings are resolutely and religiously Nordic. The haziness of Shezarr's relationship to the Divines, he is often called their missing sibling, begins with Saint Alessia, the so-called slave queen of Cyrodiil, the founding figure of the original Cyrodiilic Empire. In the earliest Syro-Nordic stories of the Heartland, Shezarr fought against the Aelids, the Heartland High Elves, on mankind's behalf. Then, for some unknown reason, he vanishes from the stage, presumably to help other humans elsewhere. And, without his leadership, the Aelids conquer the humans and enslave them. This slavery lasts for generations. The isolated humans eventually begin to venerate the pantheon of their masters, or at least assimilate so much of High Elven religious practices into their native traditions that the two became indistinguishable. In 1E242, under the leadership of Alessia, her demigod lover Morehouse Breath of Kine, and the infamous Pelinal Whitestrake, the Cyrodiilic humans revolt. When Skyrim lends its armies to the slave queen of the south, the revolution succeeds. The Aelid hegemonies are quickly overthrown. Shortly thereafter, White Gold Tower is captured by Alessia's forces, and she promptly declares herself the first Empress of Cyrodiil. Part of the package meant that she had to become the High Priestess of Akatosh as well. Akatosh was an Aldmeri god, and Alessia's subjects were as yet unwilling to renounce their worship of the Elven pantheon. She found herself in a very sensitive political situation. She needed to keep the Nords as her allies, but they were, at that time, fiercely opposed to any adoration of elven deities. On the other hand, she could not force her subjects to revert back to the Nordic pantheon for fear of another revolution. Therefore, concessions were made and Empress Alessia instituted a new religion, the 8 Divines, an elegant, well-researched synthesis of both pantheons, Nordic and Aldmeri. Shezarr, as a result, had to change. He could no longer be the bloodthirsty anti-Aldmer warlord of old. He could not disappear altogether either, or the Nords would have withdrawn their support of her rule. In the end, he had become the spirit behind all human undertaking. Even though this was merely a thinly disguised, watered-down version of Shor, it was good enough for the Nords. As for why Tiber Septim has not attempted to revitalize Shezarr during his wars against the Aldmeri Dominion, we can only speculate that, at this time, memories of the Alessian Order's follies, the Dragon Break, the War of Righteousness, the defeat at Gelnumbria Moors, would only damage his campaign for the Imperial crown. Alright, another wonderful book for us to talk about today. We've got mention of some very cool, perhaps mysterious characters, some classic clashing of the retelling of history, a whole bunch of stuff. But first, the author, Faustulus Junius. We know nothing about him. Well, nothing beyond what the introduction of the book says. He is the Sub-Curator of Ancient Theology and Paleonumerology at the Imperial Library. I imagine most of us are familiar with the meaning of ancient theology. It basically means the study of ancient gods. Paleonumerology, on the other hand, it would be understandable if you didn't know what that is. In the real world, paleo simply means old or ancient, depending on the context. Numerology is kind of a pseudoscience that tries to find connections between numbers, events, individuals, and the universe. So paleonumerology would be the study of the ancient connection between some of those same things. Anyway, the only reason I've gone on about this is because that's literally all we know about the author. We don't know when he lived, so we don't have much of a time frame for when the book could have been written, though there are a few lines later on that might give us some indication. And he didn't write any other books. This is the only one credited to Faustulus Junius. Okay, moving on. Shezarr is the titular character of this narrative. Kind of, not really. A little bit is explained in the book about who Shezarr is, but let me break it down for you. Shezarr is another name for the god Shor. Kind of. This is where you get some of the variation in the retelling of history. Maybe. Shezarr is another name for the god Shor. Shor, if you remember, is another name for the god Lorcan. Lorcan, who, upon the other gods discovering his treachery, had his heart ripped out. You can see why this might be confusing. If Lorcan had his heart ripped out and is supposedly dead, then how is it that there are reports of him fighting on behalf of humanity as Shezarr? Well, this begs the question, can you kill a god? If all these names really are the same being, and that being is Lorcan, who is the direct creation of Sithis, Lord of the Void, can he be killed? I'm going to say no. Not in how we recognize death to be. Lorcan's physical body that he had in the plane of Mundus, that is the mortal realm, was destroyed. His heart removed, shot into the sea, the whole 9 yards. But the power and essence of who he is remain. Perhaps even being tied permanently to this mortal plane due to his heart being removed and creating part of the world. Kind of. Some accounts do attribute Shor/Lorcan as having part or all of their being used in creation and possibly becoming Nirn itself. I don't find this that likely, that he became the planet itself. More likely is that he was now bound to the plane of Mundus after his heart was removed, ensuring he would endure the same fate as the other gods who would eventually become known as the Aedra. Or so they thought. If this were true, it would make Shezarr a reincarnation of sorts. But not in the classic way we would understand it. He isn't coming back based on previous lives. Think of it rather as Shezarr/Shor/Lorcan using his power to reinstitute a bodily form for himself to inhabit. So just to recap a little bit, Lorcan dies at some point during the Dawn era after being found out. He is killed and his heart removed. Because he's a god, he can't really die in that way. Perhaps thousands of years later, he reappears as the being Shezarr at some point during the Mythic era and fights on behalf of humanity before disappearing. His disappearing is credited as being a major reason for the humans being defeated and enslaved by the aliens. Okay, I think we're good to move on. The next part of the book talks about how, because of the duration of the human enslavement, the humans eventually began to worship the gods of their masters. This is an interesting statement. The assumption here is that they began to worship the beings known as the Aedra, which is an elven pantheon from Aldmeris. Aldmeris, of course, being the ancient homeland of the elves. We know that the Needs of the time were aware of the Aedra and probably worshipped at least some of them because of Alessia's pact with Akatosh. However, I don't think the statement is correct about the humans venerating the gods of their masters. The humans worshipped the Aedra, or some variation of them, and these are considered elven gods, but the Aelids are their masters. And the Aelids, throughout their entire history, and especially at the time of the Alessian Rebellion, were Daedra worshippers. Granted, not the entire population of Aelids were Daedra worshippers. The slave revolt began in 1E242, and the scouring of Wendelbeck had happened in 1E198. The scouring of Wendelbeck, if you are unfamiliar, was the conclusion to a centuries-long civil war between the Daedra and Aedra worshipping Aelids. This resulted in the Daedra worshipping side winning the war. Because of this, I find it difficult to believe the humans took on the gods of their masters, especially since the gods that they supposedly began to worship were not worshipped by the majority of the Aelids. Okay, now let's get into Morahus and Pelinal. Morahus, Breath of Kine, was a demigod. Breath of Kine because his mother was Kinnereth, Kine being another name for the same deity. By all accounts, Morahus was half man, half bull, and had wings, basically a winged minotaur. He was known as the greatest archer of the First Era, and his armor, the Lord's Mail, granted him the power of the Thu'um. He was also the consort to Alessia. Pelinal Whitestrake is also known to be a demigod, but is a bit of a different case. Upon hearing the name, one would assume his name to be Pelinal and Whitestrake to be some kind of title. In fact, both are titles of sorts. Much like Alessia herself, we don't know his actual name, only the titles that refer to the person. Pelinal is a title meaning glorious knight. It is a corruption of Pelinel, which means star-made knight. It is believed he was called Whitestrake in reference to his snow-white hair. Pelinal Whitestrake is seen as an immortal hero, with tales of him conquering all of Tamriel in the Merithic era being common. His origin shares some distinct similarities with the god Lorkhan/Shor/Shezarr. He is said to have entered the world born of Sithis. It was also said that under Pelinal's armor was a gaping wound and no heart. When the Nords first witnessed Pelinal, they said that he was the return of Shor. However, Pelinal refuted these accusations. Once a man called him Shezarr. The man was smothered to death by moths that night. Shezarr, as the name implies, is in reference to Shezarr, who is possibly also Shor. So if Shezarr is a reappearance of Shor, then the subsequent reappearances of Shezarr are referred to as Shezarr. Hopefully that makes sense. In any case, these are the two individuals helping Alessia lead the rebellion. Morahus, who is a minotaur, son of Kinnereth, demigod with wings, and also Alessia's lover, and Pelinal Whitestrake, who is either just a great champion of his time, an immortal wandering hero who has been conquering for possibly millennia, or the actual embodiment of the god Lorkhan. Moving on. Part of the package, according to the book, was that Alessia had to become the High Priestess of Akatosh. This is more or less true. With her pact with Akatosh, it makes sense that she would become his authority on Nirn, more or less. The book also says that once the armies of the North joined in, the rebellion succeeded. While this is true, I don't know if we can say that the rebellion wouldn't have succeeded without them. The next section talks about the difficulty that Alessia had arranging a pantheon of gods for the new empire. It says Akatosh was an Aldmeri god. This is kind of true, but it's weird that the book wouldn't use his actual elven name. Akatosh is the Nordic version of Ariel, Ariel being the actual god in the Aldmeri pantheon. So just saying that Akatosh was an Aldmeri god and that it caused problems because the Nords wouldn't want to recognize an elven god doesn't really make sense. It could just be glossing over the finer details, assuming the reader knows the differences without it being said, but it's still odd. Ultimately, the pantheon of the 8 divines is what was introduced as a new religion to help unite the empire. That and the interpretation of Shezarr had to change. You couldn't have him be seen as this anti-Aldmeri warlord because you were trying to bring the elves into the fold, so to speak. But you can't remove him entirely because he is an essential figure to the Nords. So the Nordic version is what became the official version, or at least a watered-down version of it, with the name Shezarr being completely removed and Shor taking his place. Shor being seen as having a hand in creation, being the warrior god of the afterlife, and the creator of Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife. In the last paragraph, we encounter some text that gives us a hint as to when this book may have been written. It speaks of Tiber Septim as if he were possibly still alive, asking the question as to why he hasn't tried to bring Shezarr back into the zeitgeist, positing that having a figure who was known as an elf-slaying warrior could help the morale of his campaign, but then pulls back and cites some of the Alessian Order's failings, essentially saying that bringing back Shezarr could bring back memory of some of the prior failures and ultimately do more harm than good. This was a bit of a dense one, a lot to talk about. Hopefully I provided enough context to make it a little easier to understand. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me what you think about this book in the comments below. And may the blessings of the 8 Divines be upon you.